shall be in such form as the attorney prescribed, shall identify.
Why are we trying to fix this problem?
I know, that's
Hey, how you doing?
all right. The Rules Committee will come to order. So it has been 460 days since I said those words in this room in person next to all of you. And I have to say, it feels damn good to be back. At least right now it does. It may not by the time this hearing is over with. But in any event, ask me again after a long meeting listening to Ed Perlmutter, and I may have a different answer. But in any event, but more seriously, this Congress and this committee has functioned in the midst of an extraordinary time that no one saw coming. I'm immensely proud that we adapted, carried on with our work, and delivered for the American people. We aren't completely back to normal yet. COVID is still a threat, which is why we meet for the first time today in a hybrid way, although I'm not sure whether that will work with our faulty technology, but we're still adhering to the guidance of the attending physician. And the attending physician's guidance for anyone who is not fully vaccinated in this committee room remains that you must wear a mask. Like a lot of businesses and organizations, we learned a lot during the height of the pandemic. We embraced technology in new ways that made us, frankly, more efficient, and we're going to keep what's working. That includes moving to electronic filing of amendments. That means no more long lines down 2 floors waiting to submit paper copies of amendments. Our new system for revisions also completely eliminates paper copies, eliminates the need for old-fashioned tools like formal letters to change amendment co-sponsors, and makes the whole process nearly instant. These changes don't only make our work at the Rules Committee more efficient, they save time and hassle for every member office in this House. You'll notice that each member on the dais now has a tablet. This will allow us to watch those members testifying remotely. Their audio will be broadcast in the room as well. These tablets will also display bill and amendment text, draft rules, and other information that used to sit in paper stacks all around us. In short, a hell of a lot less paper and fewer paper cuts, and it's better for our environment. So I want to thank our staff for their help in ironing out the details of these changes and making the process a seamless one. I especially want to recognize the work of Nate Perkins, Jessica Sue, Sam Russell, Anna Martinez, and Mary Lieb. The team at the House Recording Studio were also invaluable as we move to a hybrid setting. Sometimes bringing Congress into the 21st century means dragging it, kicking and screaming, but they got it done, and during the pandemic, no less, so we're all grateful for their work. So before I get to the agenda at hand today, let me turn to our ranking member for any general thoughts he might want to share before we get into the meat of this.
Well, I just, before our formal statements,
yeah.
okay. Yeah, just quickly, number one, I want to thank you for keeping our committee functioning under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, Mr. Chairman, and I'm very proud of your efforts and your staff's effort and the minority staff's effort to make all this work. I do think it's more than coincidental that we got rid of the mask rule just when the Oklahoma women's softball team won the national title, the third time in the last 5 years, I will point out, their 5th national title. So I came prepared to wear my mask and certainly display it very proudly, but I think you just were trying to keep me from being obnoxious when you made this decision. So, I'll refrain from the mask. Thank you, and again, the staff for getting us to this point, and tell you how great it is to be back in the same room with all of our colleagues again, and working together to try and make the House function well. So again, thank you for your leadership, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. And you can wear the mask if you want to. That's okay.
Well, the women's softball team had a better year than the Patriots this year, that's for sure. So.
I can wear it for you.
So with that, let's turn to our agenda. Today, we're considering 2 measures. First is H.R. 1187, a package of bills to hold corporations accountable, help investors make informed decisions, and build a more sustainable and equitable economic recovery. Second is H.R. 256, legislation to finally repeal the 2002 Authorization for Use of Military Force against Iraq. The war in Iraq officially ended a decade ago. There is no operational reason to keep it on the books. Repealing it now will ensure that no president of either party can use it ever again to try to justify operations far outside the scope of what Congress intended. I'll have a lot more to say about this on the floor later today, but I'm proud that Congress is starting to get off the sidelines and do its job when it comes to debating matters of war and peace. Ranking Member Cole and I are working with the Foreign Affairs Committee to repeal and reform the outdated AUMFs and reimagine the broader War Powers Resolution so it works in the modern age. I appreciate Congressman Cole's longtime dedication to reclaiming congressional authority, and I look forward to continuing to work with him on this matter. And so with that, I'll turn to the ranking member for any comments he wishes to make on the substance of what we're doing today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, let me start out by saying how pleased I am to be back in the hearing room with you today. And as I've mentioned many times over the past year, House benefits from members personally interacting with one another and developing relationships that can help bridge policy and political difference. And today marks another step in our return to normal that I hope will continue so that the House becomes fully open in the very near future. Now on to the hearing today, covering two items. First item I'll discuss is H.R. 256. If enacted, this bill would repeal the 2002 authorization for the use of military force that allowed the U.S. military engagement against Iraq. When the 2002 AUMF was first passed by Congress and signed into law 19 years ago, it was targeted against the depravity of Saddam Hussein, his vicious regime, and its ongoing role as a state sponsor of terrorism, and the fear that he secretly possessed weapons of mass destruction. Acting under this authorization, American and allied troops invaded Iraq in 2003 and quickly put an end to his regime. Unfortunately, that was only the beginning. It took years of hard fighting and heroic efforts by American, allied, and Iraqi troops to bring some semblance of order to the country. Even today, American soldiers remain in Iraq, in part to continue the fight against the remnants of al-Qaeda and their successor, the Islamic State, but also in part to continue to support our friends and allies in the Middle East. But in the 19 years since then, it's apparent that the mission has evolved and changed. As originally drafted, the 2002 AUMF provided clear legal authorities to confront Saddam Hussein and to enforce UN Security Council resolutions. But today, Saddam Hussein is gone, his odious regime is gone, and the necessary nature of American presence in Iraq is very different. As this committee is aware, I've long been supportive of Congress exercising its authority with respect to war powers. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership in that continuing effort. I believe we have a duty and an obligation to continuously re-examine justifications for the use of military force. And when existing authorities are outdated, Congress should exercise its authority to review, revise, and if necessary, repeal authorities that are no longer needed. For the last 2 decades, American military troops have been engaged in conflicts around the world, but primarily in the Middle East and Afghanistan. The legal authorities for these conflicts, the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, have not been revised or changed during these times, even as the nature of the conflicts themselves have changed. I have long been supportive of reevaluating these measures consistent with Congress's Article 1 war powers and with drafting new legal authorities to update those now in use. And over the last several years, but especially over the last week, I've wrestled with this question of how Congress should review and evaluate the 2002 AUMF and whether or not it should remain in force. I have deep concerns about simply repealing either the 2001 or 2002 AUMFs without having an appropriate authority to replace them. The very best course of action is for Congress and the administration to work together on developing a new set of appropriate authorities. And with respect to H.R. 256, I believe the administration must engage Congress and tell us the appropriate authorities they need and desire to continue to protect the American people and to continue to fight terrorism wherever it may be found. If the Biden administration believes the 2002 AUMF is still necessary and can make an appropriate case as to why, that will go a long way toward persuading Congress to keep this authority in place. If the administration believes a replacement is necessary, it's up to the administration to ask Congress for what it needs. But if the Biden administration does not need this authority or refuses to engage with Congress on what it needs or why the 2002 AUMF should remain on the books, and it does not provide members with the necessary information they need to decide if this particular authority should remain intact. Iraq has changed, the original mission has been accomplished, and using this authority for whatever the future may hold raises serious concerns to me personally. Ultimately, it's up to the administration to engage with Congress, and it's up to the Congress to engage in regular order to ensure that an appropriate set of authorizations for the use of military force are in place. On this measure, Congress cannot do its job and cannot fulfill its constitutional obligations without appropriate input from the Commander-in-Chief. However, once we have that perspective, I believe lawmakers can quickly reach a bipartisan, bicameral agreement through regular order on a new targeted AUMF that provides appropriate authority for the current mission. That's our constitutional obligation, and I believe America's soldiers and the American people deserve no less. Our second item today is H.R. 1187, the Corporate Governance Improvement and Investor Protection Act. This is a collection of 5 bills, all arising out of the Committee on Financial Services, and all of which require public companies to make various disclosures in their public filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission. These new required disclosures each relate to items that are of importance only to social activists rather than to investors. Of these 5 bills, the best I can say of them is that, in my view, they are unnecessary. The current structure of reporting for publicly traded companies in the United States generally requires them to disclose all information that is material or that would be considered important by a reasonable investor. These items generally include things you would think would be included. How much money has the company made? How much revenue does it have? How much does it cost the company to acquire that revenue, and so on. It also includes a disclosure of risk factors and many other items that are actually important for evaluating a public company's health now and into the future. But what these 5 bills do is add still more disclosure requirements on top of these. These additional disclosures include items relating to climate change, to executive pay, and to an ill-defined group of items clustered together under the term, quote, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG. What each of these have in common is that they are not actually all that important to the everyday investor. They are of great importance to social activists who are seeking to expand their agenda to every corner of the American life, including into the corporate boardroom. Expanding the list of required disclosures, as the majority is seeking to do today, will do nothing to help the everyday investors and will instead only increase the cost for public companies. That will serve as a disincentive for private companies to go public and will make it even harder for the normal Americans to invest in the future. I understand my Republican colleagues on the Financial Services Committee have additional concerns about these bills, and I look forward to hearing from them today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his statement, and he yields back. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony in H.R. 256, a bill to repeal the authorization for the use of military force against Iraq resolution of 2002. We're delighted to have Chairman Meeks and Subcommittee Ranking Member McCall here as well. We're delighted to have you both here, and we want to thank you for not only being here, but for your attempt to try to develop some sort of bipartisan consensus on how we should move forward on these matters. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, and both of you gentlemen may come up to the table, and anything that you prepared can be submitted for the record if you desire, but Chairman Meeks, the time is yours.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, for holding this meeting on rules on H.R. 256, titled to repeal the authorization of use of military force against Iraq resolution of 2002. I want to thank all of the members of the committee and my Ranking Member Mike McCall, and I would like to address both the substance and the procedure in my remarks here today. First and foremost, let me underscore that the repeal of the 2002 AUMF would have no effect on any outgoing military operations in Iraq. The United States is not relying on the 2002 AUMF as the sole authority for any military operations. It has been used as an additional legal justification for strikes by presidents from both parties, but not as the sole authority for any strikes over the last decade. This legislation does not touch upon the 2001 AUMF, still used as justification for certain strikes. It does not reform Title 50, covert action operations, and of course, it does not and cannot in any way impinge on the President's right to defend this nation under Article 2 of the Constitution. That said, I believe every member in this room knows that the executive branch will not hesitate to stretch legal authorities, sometimes to their breaking point. The 2002 AUMF has already been used by presidents from both parties, as I said, as justification for military action against entities that had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist dictatorship, primarily because these entities were operating in Iraq. Given all of the countries active near Iraq today, including Turkey and Russia, the 2002 AUMF is dangerous tinder if left on the books. Now let me briefly address some procedural claims. Twice last Congress, the House of Representatives voted to repeal the 2002 AUMF in bipartisan votes. Yet, last Congress's repeal of the 2002 authorization bypassed the House Foreign Affairs Committee. This time around, HFAC held a hearing on March 23rd, squarely on the topic, in addition to prior hearings from the previous 2 years concerning American foreign policy priorities in the Middle East and around the world. HFAC marked up H.R. 256 on March 25th of this year, and multiple members on the minority side had the chance to offer amendments. Any member who wished to speak had a chance to be heard, and many members on both sides of the aisle took advantage of this opportunity. In the end, the House Foreign Affairs ordered the measure to be reported in a strong bipartisan vote. Now, I completely understand the value of hearings and debate, but let's not pretend this is a new issue. The 2002 AUMF has been around for nearly 2 decades now. In Congress, we've been discussing what to do since Saddam's regime was toppled in April of 2003. So we're not a debating society. We are a legislative branch of the world's most powerful country, ordained by the Constitution to make judgments on issues of war and peace. We cannot and must not shy away from this responsibility. It is our responsibility. It's the hardest votes I know that I've had to take in my time here in Washington, D.C., but it's my responsibility to take and make that vote. So I thank you for your consideration of this legislation, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member McCall, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cole. Chairman Meeks and I get along very well. We try to avoid this committee as much as possible and pass things on suspension.
We do too.
But here we are today, and I do hope, as the four of us have had discussions on this issue, on an updated AUMF, that we can get to that point as an opening salvo. And I've said many times before, war should not be on autopilot. I know from our thoughtful discussions along Chairman Meeks that all of us believe that Congress needs to reclaim its war powers under Article 1 of the Constitution. And I understand the desire to repeal the 2002 AUMF as well as the 2001. But we must do that as part of an updated replacement to provide clear authorities against the terrorists who still plot to kill Americans at home and abroad. Repeal and replacement should be simultaneous. So to me, I don't believe that we should pass through a standalone repeal without even basic due diligence, without consulting the State Department or the DOD, without consulting the White House, without consulting the intelligence community, and without consulting the government of Iraq or our coalition partners and allies. Is that, what? Okay. In the 3 months since I've been making this case, we have not had schedule a single briefing. We did have a hearing, as the chairman mentioned. The committee report filed on this bill last week listed 7 hearings as somehow related to this bill, but 6 of those hearings did not even mention AUMF or discuss its repeal. This is a serious issue, and as the chairman said, perhaps the most serious issue that we face as members of Congress, issues of war and peace. And while the 2002 AUMF was largely about Saddam Hussein, it is also clearly used to address terrorist threats in and emanating from Iraq. All prior administrations, Republican and Democrat, have used it for that purpose. And there are Iran-sponsored terrorist groups active today inside Iraq who threaten our diplomats, our soldiers, and our citizens. They cannot be targeted using the 2001 AUMF because they are not associated with the forces of al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or ISIS. But they can be targeted using the 2002 AUMF. The last time we were able to consult with DOD lawyers was last administration. They strongly opposed standalone repeal, citing the AUMF as a force authority against such Shia militia threats in the region. They also believed it served as a legal basis for the continued detention of ISIS fighters as recognized by U.S. courts. Unless we hear from our military that the 2002 AUMF no longer serves purpose in protecting Americans, we should not repeal before replacing. And finally, a rushed standalone repeal of our Iraq force authority sends a message of U.S. disengagement that could destabilize Iraq, embolden Iran, and strengthen al-Qaeda and ISIS. Real AUMF reform requires Congress and the administration to work together on the actual text to replace the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs. By repealing and replacing, we can provide the authorities needed to keep the American people and our deployed troops safe from terrorists. I think we all agree on the goal here. We just have a different way of accomplishing this. I think we all know how this movie's going to end, as it has before. But I do hope to the two chairmen here and the ranking member that we can work together moving forward to find an updated approach to this AUMF. Now you'll back.
I thank you. Thank you both for your testimony. I just want to, I just was handed a statement of administration policy. Basically, the administration says it supports the repeal of the 2002 AUMF, as the United States has no ongoing military activities that rely solely on the 2002 AUMF as a domestic legal basis, and repeal of the 2002 AUMF would likely have minimal impact on our current military operations. This goes on to say that that they want to work with us on updating AUMFs. I mean, I think I hear where Mr. McCall is coming from. I think, especially with regard to the 2001 AUMF, I understand the concern by some to have a replacement ready, but on this, I mean, I have for a long time believed that we should repeal this, as well as any other outstanding AUMFs that we go back, years. I mean, we have national emergency declarations, old AUMFs that are so outdated that the idea that they have not been repealed or ended just doesn't make any sense. It's either that we just haven't done our due diligence, or we're not keeping a close watch on these things. But in any event, like both of you said, we need to. This is the time. This is a timely discussion. There ought to be hearings, there ought to be briefings and consultations. But I think on this one, I tend to agree with Mr. Meeks, which is no surprise to anybody because I've wanted this repeal for a long time. But I don't really have any questions. I'm going to yield to Mr. Cole for any comments or questions he may have.
Well, just a couple quick comments and quick questions. But first, I just want to congratulate both of you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member. I get a series of statements where you guys are so often in agreement and find common ground and work together so well. That's not true of every committee that comes here to testify. You guys really have set a wonderful standard, and I give both of you, and certainly you, Mr. Chairman, the credit for doing that. I think it speaks well of the country, and I think it speaks well of the Congress to so often find you on the same page. And even when you differ, as you do today, it's not only civil, but frankly, you're still driving toward the same objectives. And as the ranking member put it, maybe in a little bit different way. But again, it's a very refreshing thing to see up here, and thank both of you for doing that. I was going to ask before I saw the statement of administration policy about where they were, so I'm glad to have a very clear guidance from the administration on that, what they think. Just a couple of questions, Mr. Chairman. Have you had any briefings or discussions with the Department of Defense, State, NC, or NSC, intelligence community about the legislation today? I know you've had a hearing, but I'd like to know a little bit more about the nature of your communications broadly across the executive branch on this topic.
Yeah, March 23rd, the House Foreign Affairs Committee had, and the Rules Committee held a hearing on the AUMF and war powers issue. We had Jack Goldsmith, who's a minority witness and a Justice Department official for the Bush administration, who expressed support for the repeal of the 2002 AUMF during the hearing and underscored that it is not needed for any ongoing military operations. The House Foreign Affairs Committee then marked it up after that. In that regards. And there's been numerous others, so this is not the first time. Even before I became chair, the committee had various hearings. You can go back to July of 2014, for example, where the National Security Advisor wrote Speaker Boehner that as American combat troops have completed their withdrawal from Iraq on December 18th of 2011, the Iraq AUMF is no longer used for any U.S. government activities, and the administration fully supports its repeal. So this is not a new thing. There's been conversations going back to 2014 in regards to this repeal, and so I think that ample opportunity has been given to address this matter. And as the chairman has indicated, he and Congresswoman Barbara Lee have had several times in which they put bills up, some of which have passed the House in the past.
One other question, Mr. Chairman. Any particular reason why you decided to move ahead before we had a replacement, or do you just think it's so irrelevant that we don't really need it anymore? I'm just curious as to why we're not seeing the replacement and the repeal simultaneously.
Well, because we know that in 2001, we are not touching that, and that would be one where we have ongoing commitments, and that would be we would consider repeal and replacement. But the 2002 seems to be one of those types of bills that the chairman and you, Mr. Ranking Member, talk about. It's just irrelevant at this particular point. And so as a result, Saddam Hussein and the Ba'athists has been gone since 2003. So it's one of those irrelevant in the sense of being effective. So therefore, we want to move forward with it.
Thank you. Ranking Member McCall, let me ask you essentially the same questions. Have you had any briefings, discussions with Department of Defense, State, National Security Council, and Intel community about moving ahead this legislation that's before us today?
No, not those entities. We did have one hearing with a DOJ lawyer, as the chairman said, but to me, if we're going to do something this serious, we should be looking at an updated AUMF to address the replacement. And we haven't talked to the Department of Defense, State Department, the intelligence community. As the four of us discussed, I think that is what we need to be doing, and whether it's in a classified setting or in a hearing or just a briefing, so we can get to something that will cover what I believe is sort of what's left undone here, and that would be the Iran-sponsored terrorist groups active today in Iraq that threaten our diplomats, soldiers, and citizens. This would also leave open contractors and diplomats and citizens, because the AUMF only pertains to military. So I do think it is exposing a danger to those in the region. And, again, I'm not opposed to repealing this, and I think it's high time. But let's sit down with the experts and talk about what they need to update this AUMF, and then do that simultaneously. And I will say the chairman and I have repealed two AUMFs already, the 1957 one and 1991 Gulf War, which obviously has no relevance today. But this one, I still believe it does. It's outdated on, obviously, Saddam Hussein, but it's not on with respect to what the current threat is that I think a new AUMF could address.
Well, you may have answered this question, but let me just put it another way. We have, as the chairman pointed out, fulfilled the original missions laid out in the 2002 AUMF. Saddam Hussein's gone. Iraq's no longer a state sponsor of terrorism. And, of course, we have through this statement of administration policy, the administration's belief that it doesn't need this authority, I think, for ongoing military action in its own opinion. So given that, why shouldn't we just move ahead with a repeal?
Well, I'm glad the administration has finally come out with an SAP, but prior to this, they have not engaged this committee on this issue until right now, right as we're before the Rules Committee. And I don't think that's, I think, look, and as they also state in the SAP, they want to work with Congress to update this AUMF. And I know the chairman and I are committed to that process. I think the two of you are as well. And I look forward to doing that. But I think we should do it in a serious manner where we are talking to the DOD, State Department, intelligence community experts, about this.
Well, last question. I mean, again, there is a lot of common ground here, and there certainly was in our four-way discussion that we had. If we need to do something new, can't we just come back and do it after this is gone? I mean, nothing would prevent us from doing that. And again, it doesn't sound as if anything we're doing now would be jeopardized by the repeal.
Well, it would expose the groups I talked about, the civilians and the diplomats not covered under the 2001 AUMF. The 2002, repealing that would expose them to harm, and it would not address what is, I believe, the current threat, and that's proxies of Iran that are state-sponsored terrorist groups.
Mr. Chairman, were you getting ready to add something?
No, I was just going to add that, I would agree with Mr. McCall on the 2001 AUMF. And we've got to work together. I look forward to working together to repeal and replace, and working with all of the administration and DOD, et cetera. That is something that is absolutely essential, and we will be on the committee having a lot of hearings in that regard. That's very serious and very important to the United States of America. Just I repeat what I said before in regards to the 2002 AUMF, there is just, we've completed our duty. We've completed our responsibility in Iraq, and so therefore I don't think there's any reason to not move forward on that at this time.
Thank you very much. Thank both of you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Torres.
I have no questions.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to Mr. McCall and Chairman. And I do want to point out that this bill was passed probably, 4 months before Mr. Cole and I took office. And there are only two people in this room, our two chairs, who were actually here when this bill was on the
Don't
floor.
tell me that. I had black hair then.
I still didn't have any.
So let me just ask, Ranking Member McCall, does this in any way dilute getting something meaningfully done on the 2001 AUMF? Or are we going to lose any steam, any momentum going forward by doing this now?
Yeah, I mean, our position, we were ready to repeal the 2001 and 2002 and update it with something that is modernized, which I think makes a lot of sense. We hadn't heard from the administration until just 5 minutes ago about where they even stood on this issue, even though we marked it up at a committee and hadn't consulted with the experts. So I think the chairman and I, as we've expressed to the chair and ranking member of this committee, that we are committed to an update of this AUMF process and the War Powers Act, and I think it's time. As Mr. McGovern said, it's been a long time, and this committee has that jurisdiction to do it. So, to your point, we all know again how this is going to end. It'll most likely pass, probably not go anywhere in the Senate, and then we're back to where we are. And I think from a pragmatic standpoint, it would behoove all of us on both sides of the aisle to try to work on something that makes sense to both Republicans and Democrats moving forward after we talk to the experts.
So is there any sense from what they're thinking the other side of the rotunda about this? I know there's been a significant amount of enthusiasm on the House side to push this along. Are you seeing any similar enthusiasm on the Senate side?
I mean, in terms of Article 1 constitutional authority, I have had discussions with others in the Senate that don't believe this will get through, but I can't speak for the Senate, or don't even try to.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I guess my feeling is this is long overdue. This will pass the House, as you've suggested, and you're going to have plenty of time to work out the details. And we need to clean this up. It's been something we've been talking about for years. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd associate my remarks with the ranking member as always, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. You pointed at me, though, so does that mean that you, I thought you were, anyway. Mr. Raskin.
I appreciate very much your bringing this forward, and I have no further questions.
Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I associate my thoughts with the ranking member, and I'll point right at him with that ranking member. And I yield back. Thank you very much.
Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. I appreciate you bringing this to us. I think it's long past time that Congress reclaims its power in this arena, and I would just note that we now have members serving in our armed forces who were not born when this was passed. Thank you.
Good point.
Yield back.
Mr. Morelli.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the chair and the ranking member. I think I come down, I thought Mr. Cole asked what essentially is the operative question, which is what's the risk here of the repeal? I think, if we want to reestablish the balance between, the appropriate balance between the Article 1 and Article 2 branches of government and the rights of the Congress, seems to me repeal, even absent replacement, is the right thing to do. And I don't see any risk to this in the sense that it seems highly outdated in terms of the language of the AUMF from 2002. And frankly, it doesn't seem to me, and you can comment on this, if there's a threat, isn't Congress sufficiently prepared to enact a new AUMF on a moment's notice if necessary? So you're already working on that. The administration, which would typically be opposed to this, is not. So I guess I'm at a loss as to why we wouldn't do this and work on a replacement if that's necessary.
Well, and I think we should work on a replacement. I think to answer your question, the class of persons that are exposed and at risk, if we do this, are the diplomats and our citizens and contractors inside of Iraq. AUMF only applies to military, so they would be at risk. And I agree, an updated, modernized AUMF would attack what is the new threat of the day, which is Iran-sponsored, proxy terrorist groups inside of Iraq. Because if you've seen the strikes that have taken place, the president struck two of these guys in Syria. Of course, Soleimani is another case inside of Iraq. That is the new threat to Iraq today. It's not Saddam Hussein. And so, while I agree most of what you say, it would expose that class of individuals.
And Mr. Chair, how would you respond to that?
I'll just say that clearly any additional threat, the president is prepared and has Article 2 that he can always protect the American people in that regard. And so therefore, we're protected for any new threats that might present itself. The president can move in expeditious manner necessary in that regards. But what we were trying to do here is also say that the Congress of the United States of America, as intended by the Constitution and its founding fathers, is exercising its authority on the AUMF and War Powers Act.
Yeah, and I guess I would, before I yield back, Mr. Chair, I think that is compelling. We want to make sure that Congress is as dutifully, that we're responsible for our obligations under the Constitution. I think this restores that balance. It doesn't seem to me we need a continuous AUMF in order to meet our obligations. I think, as the chairman points out, there's plenty of room under Article 2 where the president can carry out when there's a threat to the American public, and it doesn't seem to me we need a continuously authorized use to be able to prepare for a replacement. So I'll yield back and I'll support the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have nothing to add. I yield back.
It worked. Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Sort of.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks both to the chairman and the ranking member of Foreign Relations. I want to just add one thing to all of the good comments that I've heard from my colleagues. I'm from North Carolina, and we have a large military population, both active duty and retired, and we owe them a debt to do our jobs. And when we authorize the use of military force, if that authorization is no longer required, it's our job to repeal it. It's our job to tell our troops when we think they should go into harm's way and when we think that time has expired. And for that reason, in addition to the reason of my colleagues, I think it's setting an excellent example to repeal this authorization. I encourage my colleagues to do it, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Neguse. I don't think he's with us right now. Let me, are there any other members who wish to any other questions of this panel? Let me just close by saying, again, I appreciate you both being here. And I also appreciate you both willing to undertake what is going to be a very difficult task of coming up with a new AUMF, obviously working in a bipartisan way, working with Congress. I think whether or not, liberals and conservatives and moderates and everybody can come together on something like that, and you have unanimity remains to be seen. But I think, an open, transparent process where everybody is consulted, where we can define what in fact is the world view of the current administration. Where do they see the threats, and how do they, and also how do they look back on how the AUMF has been utilized in the past, and whether it has been the wisest, whether we've made the wisest choices. So, but I really appreciate it, and since there are no other questions, we thank you for being here, and you can leave.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members who wish to testify on H.R. 256? Hearing none, that closes the hearing on H.R. 256. We now are going to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 1187, the Corporate Governance Improvement and Investor Protection Act. We have Chairwoman Maxine Waters and Ranking Member Hill. We are delighted that you are here. And as soon as Chairwoman Waters gets here, we're all... Hey, Stephen. I know, we're... Hello. All right. Chairwoman Waters, whenever you're ready, you can testify. Just make sure your microphone's on. Is the mic on there? Just make sure. There you go.
The mic is on now. Thank you, Chairman McGovern, and thank you to my colleagues on the Rules Committee. I would like to begin by applauding Mr. Vargas, who has been a strong proponent for investors, for leading this very important package of environmental, social, and governance proposals, also referred to as ESG. I'd also like to thank my Financial Services Committee colleagues, Mr. Foster, Ms. Velasquez, Mr. Caston, and Ms. Axney, for their important contributions to this package. For years, investors and market participants have been demanding more and better disclosures regarding ESG matters, which research shows have significant impacts on the short and long-term values of companies. For example, a report issued by the BlackRock Investment Institute found that companies that score high on ESG measures are better able to adapt to environmental and societal trends, use resources more efficiently, and have more productive employees, and tend to face lower risk of reputational damage and regulatory action. According to a report from the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is a coalition of bankers, fund managers, and advocacy groups, climate change will cost the 215 largest listed companies nearly $1 trillion over the next 5 years alone. And estimates show that if left unmanaged, climate change could cost the global financial sector upwards of $24.2 trillion in today's dollars. And these issues are not just limited to climate matters related to the ways companies invest in their workers and further diversity, spend their cash on political expenditures, their global human rights records, their tax avoidance strategies, and how they invest in crucial corporate infrastructure, such as cybersecurity, all are significant factors in companies' short and long-term viability. Investors, who are the true owners of our nation's public companies, recognize the importance of this information to their decision-making and have been demanding this information for years. For example, in 2018, a coalition of public pension funds, asset managers, and others representing over $5 trillion in assets petitioned the SEC for rulemaking on mandatory ESG disclosures. Over 2,300 investment managers, asset managers, and service providers representing over $80 trillion in assets under management have become signatories to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, which commit to incorporating ESG factors into their investment decisions. A group of 35 institutional investors representing over $6.6 trillion in assets formed the Human Capital Management Coalition and has petitioned the SEC to adopt rules to require issuers to disclose information related to their human capital management policies, practices, and performance. When the SEC solicited comments on political spending disclosures in 2011, it received over 1 million comments, by far more comments than any other SEC rulemaking petition, and the vast majority of which were overwhelmingly favorable. And yet, SEC's efforts were stymied because Senate Minority Leader has personally insisted on statutorily prohibiting the SEC from even studying the issue. It is past time we passed H.R. 1187, which will create clear, consistent disclosure standards for issuers and finally provide investors in our markets with the information they need to make the best investment decisions possible and to hold the companies they're invested in accountable. So with that, I would urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 1187, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. I now yield to Ranking Member Hill.
I thank my friend from Massachusetts for the invitation. Good to be with you, Chair Waters. Ranking Member Cole, thank you for the opportunity to testify today before the Rules Committee on H.R. 1187. Committee Republicans are strongly opposed to H.R. 1187. Instead of encouraging capital formation or protecting investors, this bill uses our securities laws to push a left-wing partisan agenda by naming and shaming public companies. I testified before you today on behalf of Committee Republicans, but I've also spent the better part of 4 decades in the leadership in both public and private companies. I've been engaged in quality corporate governance practices throughout. This legislation will layer on requirement after requirement for public companies, mandating them to disclose environmental, social, and governance issues, as well as climate risk metrics, to be set by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, not Congress, and not based on a consensus within industries or across industry segments. As for mandated descriptions of any expenditure for political activities and donations for political candidates or trade organizations, duplicating existing disclosure requirements. Calls for the mandated disclosure of the ratio between pay raise percentages of company executives with the pays raise percentages of companies' media employees, the same kind of mandatory CEO pay ratio disclosure that Democrats put in Dodd-Frank. And finally, it mandates country-by-country financial reports from multinational companies, upending the current country-by-country reporting rules mandated already by the IRS. More, Mr. Chairman, is not always better. More mandatory disclosures will not help investors. We should stay focused on the tried and true principles of requiring disclosures when those are material to making an investment decision. I want to remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that materiality has been the baseline for investor disclosures for 8 decades, dating back to the origins of the federal securities laws. This principle has helped make our capital markets the envy of the world. As Justice Marshall said in his Supreme Court opinion from 1976, some information is of such dubious significance that insistence on its disclosure may accomplish more harm than good. If the standard of materiality is unnecessarily low, Management's fear of exposing itself to substantial liability may cause it to simply bury shareholders in an avalanche of trivial information as a result that's hardly conducive to informed decision-making. Further, Mary Jo White, the previous chair of the SEC during the Obama administration, articulated in a speech, when disclosure gets to be too much or strays from its core purposes, it can lead to information overload, a phenomenon which ever-increasing amounts of disclosure make difficult for investors to focus on the information that is material and most relevant to their decision-making. The SEC knows how to regulate for materiality. They've been working off that decision for 45 years. That's their expertise. They do not know how to regulate climate-related issues, campaign finance issues, and international tax laws matters, nor should they. That's the purview of scientists, the FEC, and the IRS. To be abundantly clear, if the information required by this bill were something that actually presented a material investment risk to the company, then all of our public companies already have an obligation by law to report that. This bill simply imposes unnecessary, costly, and in some cases potentially confusing and misleading requirements on companies. This will only discourage companies from going public and encourage many to stay private. Ultimately, it means fewer investment options for everyday investors who are saving for their children's education, retirement, or just building a better life. And it provides misleading mandates that aren't easily comparable across industries, which in turn would provide fuel for trial lawyers. Our U.S. publicly traded companies are responsive to shareholder engagement, and they have dramatically improved their governance practices over the past 2 decades by increasing diverse independent directors and increasing attention to the business judgment rule and the fiduciary duty of care. Let's take a peek at just one U.S. iconic company, Procter & Gamble. In 2000, their annual proxy statement was 56 pages. Today, it's 111 pages. Additionally, like the vast majority of public companies in the S&P 500, P&G has significant disclosure of all their ESG initiatives, all their political contributions, and all their sales country by country around the globe. So instead of reducing investment options for Americans, we should support American business and everyday investors trying to save their hard-earned money. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I have no questions. Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hill, can you tell me why you think the Democratic majority wants to place, these are pretty significant compliance burdens. Why do you want to, why do they want to put these additional burdens on that might disincentivize investment?
Well, as the chairwoman outlined, shareholders over the past 2 decades have asked for more disclosure in things like ESG, and the companies are responding in the free marketplace. They're spending hundreds of pages every year disclosing things that they believe are material to their company. They're putting that in the financial statements under existing SEC law. And for additional information like political contributions and things of that nature, they're putting out on their website for disclosure. In my view, the majority in this instance is trying to give fodder to this climate discussion, create, I think, a mandate where one is not possible. Example, in the bill that's before us, it mandates using the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure as a mandate. This is the Mike Bloomberg Commission. And yet when you look at public companies who are disclosing various types of sustainability data, 51% use one method, 14% use another. Only 5% use the Task Force on Climate Disclosure. So mandating that isn't even agreed on in the industry. So I think it's a name and shame situation, Mr. Ranking Member, that this mandate's not ready for prime time. And I believe that industry is working on these things. They're already disclosing lots of information to their investors, but a mandate right now would be too costly. It would particularly hurt small and emerging public companies and be a detriment to smaller market cap companies for trying to go public.
I'm going to ask Madam Chair, both you and Mr. Hill, were there any substantive discussions between the majority and the minority about this legislation before it was introduced? I know you quite often try to find common ground in these areas, and I'm just curious if that effort happened in this particular occasion.
Let me answer this by saying, of course, there has been substantive discussions going on about this legislation This is not the first time this legislation is being introduced. Let me also add to that, that while Mr. Hill talks about what is being done by public companies, he has not been able to basically identify specific actions that are being taken by companies. We know that companies understand that the investors really do want to have more information. They have been asking for it, they have been demanding it, and they deserve it. This argument about too much information is not good for one who's investing just doesn't make good sense. As a matter of fact, the investors want more information, and they understand the potential danger of climate change, and they know what it's going to cost our economy in general, and of course the companies in particular. And so for all of these reasons, it is time for Congress to step up to the plate and give assistance to these companies who would like to have some leadership and some definition of what they should do in order to meet these standards. So I would ask for support for the companies and for the investors.
Mr. Hill?
Well, on your first point, have there been conversations? I agree with the chairwoman that there are always conversations about SEC disclosure on this topic. It is not a new topic before the Congress. But on the other hand, Republican members who are trying to get this right and do it in the right way were called climate deniers, and we don't need any more studies, we need action and things of that nature during our markup of this bill. But let me repeat again, companies are dealing with this. They have disclosed these things for two ways. One, if it's material, they're already disclosing it. Who's doing that in their financial statements? An example would be the public utility industry. They're disclosing their carbon footprint, how their long-term plan to reduce their carbon footprint, because that's a classic. But when you get beyond certain industries, it's very complex, costly to do that, and it's not comparable across industries. These bills are a mandate to do it and do it today, and if it's not done within 2 years, in the case of Mr. Caston's bill, it's to revert to this, the Task Force for Climate Disclosure that was chaired by Mike Bloomberg. And yet, as I reported to you, of all the public companies in the S&P 500, only 5% use the Task Force for Climate Disclosure point of view. 51% use another method. 14% use a Sustainability Accounting Standards Board definition. 36% use the United Nations definition on social governance metrics. So there's not agreement within industries or across industries about how to do this in a way that's appropriate for financial statements. So I argue this is premature. Republicans have offered that we ask the SEC to study all of these issues, how it's being done in the public companies now, and pick up the one that's the best approach instead of imposing a mandate. I also would argue that many of these bills violate Justice Marshall's point of view about materiality. They require mandated disclosure even if it's not material to the financial performance of the company.
I believe that Mr. Hill has just made a good argument for why it is important for us to give some guidance. Because there are no explicit requirements, disclosures are inconsistent and not usable by the investors. This is why they are demanding these disclosures. The companies want us to give them some guidance and to have some standards. And I think it's very important not to take a look at what is being done by individual public companies, which is all over the place. I think that it is important for us to understand, as public policy makers, what our responsibilities are in helping them to have the kind of standards that they can all be in compliance with. That's what they're looking for.
Let me ask this question, and Mr. Hill, you may have anticipated it, part of your answer, but again, it seems to me I'm always a little leery when Congress gets in the business of micromanaging something that the SEC has done for a long time. I'm a modest investor. I never had a big problem getting my hands on the information I thought I needed to invest in any publicly traded company in the United States. My experience is when you leave these matters up to politicians, they think politically as well as financially. I look at these as mostly individual financial decisions for the investor to make. Has the SEC, again, expressed any need to go beyond what it's doing now, that looking at these things? And if it is, why wouldn't we wait until they came and told us, okay, we think now, given a thorough study, these are the things we need and might need additional powers from Congress to implement?
Well, the SEC has addressed this in notice for rulemaking and comment from investors and issuers alike, most recently in the last 90 days, and that comment period ends this week, where they asked for a comment from publicly traded companies, issuers, stockholders, investors, institutional investors for comments on this very matter. And so my view is, let's let them consider that and follow the Administrative Procedures Act. I acknowledge what the chairwoman says about the diversity of approach, and that's true, but that's because there is no agreement. And these bills, Mr. Ranking Member, take that decision out of the hands of knowledgeable scientists, industry executives, and create a mandate here, picking one of these 7 or 8 different versions that the companies are working through. I'd also argue what's good for one industry might not be good for another. It's not comparable. What might work in the public utility industry won't work for Procter & Gamble in trying to analyze their impact on the climate going forward. We believe this is best left to the industry to fine-tune what those expectations are, and the Commission, following materiality and the Administrative Procedures Act, to take their normal course and see what's best for issuers and investors.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Torres. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, one of the things that concerns me greatly is the move to consolidation in a number of industries. And I would worry that in the financial service industry, you are going to be perhaps putting at a disadvantage smaller companies that might be thinking about going private, raising capital, going public, raising capital that route. Now the barriers are just going to be too high, and they'll abandon those goals, and as a consequence, they may not be able to develop and grow as they might have been had they been able to go public. Is there any concern that you're furthering the cause of encouraging larger and fewer branches on the tree by pushing this type of legislation?
Well, Mr. Burgess, in my view, yes, because this is very expensive, and one issue that Mike Bloomberg brought up in the Task Force on Climate Disclosure is that these are very difficult calculations to make. They're very uncertain, and importantly, for financial considerations, the time frame is unknown. So it's a very expensive disclosure to undertake. And while Procter & Gamble might be willing to do it, a startup small business in Dallas might not be able to do that. So I do believe that that's why the SEC has a statutory obligation to conduct cost-benefit analysis on any time it increases public financial disclosure like this, and I would encourage the Commission to take that into account.
Mr. Burgess, if I may, to assume that the SEC would not take into consideration the size of companies, and to assume that those companies that would like to go public somehow are going to be discouraged from doing it because it will be too costly, are assumptions that I really don't think should be made. I think that what we should understand is, first of all, these bills were marked up this Congress, and were also marked up last Congress with a lot of support. And I don't think that the small versus the big is an issue. I think that, number one, as we deal with climate change, we're all in this, no matter what size you are. And I think the SEC, certainly with the right resources, which I'm determined they should have in order to do this work, will take into consideration size, cost, and all of those things. So I would not anticipate that somehow, that they would only be thinking about what is good for the big companies, and as opposed to what is good for all of those who are going to become public anyway.
Well, again, I'm just concerned about the amount of consolidation, whether it be healthcare, energy, over and over and over again, you see the favoring going to consolidate, be a larger corporation, leaving the mom and pops behind. So it is a continuous concern that I have, but I thank you both for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you two for joining us in the Rules Committee. I appreciate seeing my colleagues from Financial Services here. Mr. Hill, you make a lot of good points, but these points have been made for several years now. I mean, these bills have been introduced, I'd say at least 4 to 6 years, and really little has been done. And I know you come from a position as a lender, as a banker. I mean, these very same things that are being suggested be disclosed to investors are things that lenders demand when they're making a loan to a company. You know, what is going to be, what are the risks? What are the environmental risks? Are you subject to wildfires? Are you subject to, you know, being shut down because you've got a methane emission? That's why activist investors just got on the board of ExxonMobil. I mean, am I wrong in saying that we've been debating this now for several years?
Well, I would say we have been debating it in Congress, but the most important place for that debate to be taking place is out in the private sector, where shareholders and boards of directors have been debating this and discussing it and make progress for 2 decades.
And that's why I'm bringing up lenders, because I want you to put your lender hat on. As a lender, you're going to ask these very same questions as to what are the risks that are associated with your public service company or Procter & Gamble when we make you a big loan.
So, and again, I refer you back to Mayor Bloomberg and Governor Mark Carney and the Task Force on Financial Disclosure report, which just issued its report in 2017, and said while this was an important move to make, which is greater disclosure, there was no agreement on exactly how to do that. And they said more work had to be done industry by industry to get the kind of metrics that were comparable across companies and comparable across industries. And one of the biggest challenges, of course, is time frame and what to measure. And to your example in lending, let's say you have a 5-year or 10-year real estate loan. That's a fairly short time frame for a payout. And the ascertaining of the risks associated with that are pretty clear, as opposed to a long-tailed investment, like you might have in an equity investment in some place that might have more climate exposure.
But you don't disagree that an investor is entitled to that same information. It may be a longer time frame.
No, but they're getting that information now, and if it's material, a company already is required to disclose that. And a lender, of course, to use your example, has an opportunity to demand that of any customer it wants, under any terms that it wants. It's not going to read it in a 10-K to know it to be the case, and the same's true for an insurance underwriter.
Exactly. They can demand it because of their power in the transaction. Right. So the purpose here, and I think what we've had as testimony over these umpteen years now, is that investors, Mrs. McGillicuddy that lives down the road, is entitled to some of this very same information, but they don't have the market power to demand it. And so 2017, the Bloomberg report comes out. We're 4 years down the road and really haven't advanced the ball at all. And I guess the difference between my Republican colleagues on the committee and the Democrats is, okay, it's time to act. We've been sitting on this, on these various subjects now for several years, and that is a difference. You make good points, but these points have been made now for at least 6 years, as long as I've been sitting on that committee.
Well, I just would argue that I think you're missing a point that there has been tremendous work done across industries and industry groups, and that's exactly what the commission wants to see happen, where you have in the public power industry some consensus about what to disclose and how to disclose it and how to compare it across industries, across their industry. That's not completely in sync around the United States and other industries, or even between the U.S. and companies headquartered outside the U.S. And the Bloomberg report, while it is considered the gold standard of background information, and Mr. Kasten used it as the basis for his bill, I would argue is the cart before the horse. In other words, the companies are not ready to have a mandate to do this. And in the meantime, a majority, over 80% of the Fortune 1500 are disclosing sustainability metrics, working with their shareholders, working with their boards of directors and their teams on that, but they're not comparable, to the chairwoman's point, but they're not ready to be comparable because that data is not fully vetted yet industry by industry. That's what the Bloomberg report outlines, and that's why companies are working on it so mightily to do that. And but I would argue, in conclusion on that point, the market is working. Investors want this information. They're getting it from their companies, and I used Procter & Gamble, I think is a good example.
Let me turn to the chairwoman, see
Yes.
if she wants to add anything, and then I'll
Yes,
yield back.
well, first of all, as I said earlier, while Mr. Hill tends to define all of the work that is being done by companies with their investors, he cannot be specific about it because I think that's a generalization. And I think he really believes that, but I don't think that he has any real proof of all of these advancements that are being made by these public companies that's satisfying the investors. You are absolutely right, Mr. Perlmutter. The investors want to have information. They have a right to it. They've been demanding it. And for any of us, even though we may be small individuals, investing whatever we're able to invest, we want the information, and we ask for it. And sometimes we're getting some information, but most of the time, investors have not been satisfied of the information that's available to them. And we know that the SEC has a responsibility for giving some direction and setting some standards and developing the body of law that is so necessary in order to deal with this climate change problem. And so I think that these big public companies, recognizing how detrimental it can be if they don't pay attention and if they don't take certain actions, I think in the final analysis, they will welcome leadership from the Congress of the United States working with the SEC. So I would ask for support, for this legislation and not in any way attempt to talk about, as Mr. Hill has done, too much information is detrimental. I don't buy that. It doesn't compute with me. I think people want more information, and they deserve more information.
And I thank you, and I'm proud to serve with you too, and I yield back.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as always, I associate my remarks with the ranking member, and this time I'm going to clearly point to Mr. Cole. I yield back.
All right.
You guys are looking for brownie points.
Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Who does the corporation belong to, Ms. Waters? Does it belong to the shareholders, or does it belong to the CEO and the executives?
It belongs to the shareholders.
So the information the shareholders are seeking is really their information.
Their information.
It's about their corporation, right?
Their corporation.
I'm amazed at where we are on the question of corporate political expenditures. The Supreme Court in the Citizens United case said that corporations, this was, for the first time in American history in 2010, enjoy the political rights of the citizenry, and so could spend whatever they wanted in politics because the corporation has rights that are derivative of the shareholders, because it's the shareholders that have First Amendment rights. It's not the First Amendment right of the CEO to spend millions of dollars out of the corporate treasury. That money belongs to the shareholders, and it's their rights which are purportedly being exercised through Citizens United. And yet now we have corporations that don't even want to disclose to their shareholders what their political expenditures are when they're spending that money in the name of the shareholders? I mean, am I understanding that they are resisting turning over information to the shareholders about how their money is being spent in political campaigns?
Well, yes, sir, Congressman, and the SEC has been banned from looking into political spending in appropriations by McConnell. And so what we're finding...
Wait, right now you're saying there is a ban on the SEC acting on this?
Yes.
So when people say, well, why is Congress getting involved? Let's leave it to an administrative agency. And I don't even understand the logic of that argument. But when they say that, they basically know full well the SEC can't do anything because it's handcuffed right now. So what we're saying is let's take the handcuffs off the SEC and let's allow the shareholders to get information about how their money is being spent in politics. So, if someone has a pension, they own a little pension fund that they've been putting into for their 20 or 30 years in service, and that pension money is invested partly in some big corporation, right now, do they know what the political activities of the corporation are?
No, they do not.
Well, maybe they shouldn't know. Maybe it should be up to the CEOs and the executives. Maybe they should be able to use that like a little political piggy bank because they know what's in the best interests of the company or the best interests of the country. What about that? I think that's what we're hearing from the other side. Let the CEO decide, and don't you worry your little minds about where all this money is going. We'll take care of it. Am I understanding right what this conversation's about?
I think you are.
All right. Well, I think that this H.R. 1187 is absolutely critical, and we need Mr. Foster's bill on shareholder political transparency. These companies are spending millions and millions of dollars of the shareholders' money in the name of the shareholders, exercising the First Amendment rights of the shareholders, and the shareholders have a right to know. And people ask why a majority of people under 30 are calling themselves socialists today and denouncing socialism. Let's make capitalism work for the people who are involved in it. Let's make capitalism work for the shareholders so there's some democracy in it. And on the climate change legislation, it's, again, startling to me that there are people who are objecting to the companies making disclosures about the financial and business risks associated with investing in their company. Not what the environmental risks are necessarily. It's not a moral point that's being made, as I understand Mr. Casten's bill. It's just a business point, which is how safe is our money being invested in whatever it might be?
That's right.
And it applies across the board. Does it apply not to all companies, that all companies have to disclose risks associated with climate change?
Absolutely requires, Mr. Casten's bill requires public companies to disclose in their annual reports information relating to the financial and business risk associated with climate change. The bill also requires the SEC to establish, in consultation with other relevant financial agencies, climate-related risk disclosure metrics and guidance, which will be industry-specific and will require companies to make both quantitative and qualitative disclosure.
Okay. Well, look, I appreciate very much your bringing this forward. I think it's a scandal, actually, that right now companies are not disclosing to the shareholders what their political activities are, what the business risks associated with their climate change portfolio is, or their basic business model. And the idea that we would just keep going along with the status quo so that the SEC couldn't act, and we're told we shouldn't act because the SEC should take care of it, but they're not allowed to act? Come on. That just strikes me like a ridiculous situation, and I thank you for bringing this forward. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Fischbach.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to associate myself with the comments from the ranking member, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think standards are critical for investors. Investors are making decisions and they're comparing various investment opportunities. The fact that you need to have apples-to-apples information to be able to make those judgments seems to me is imperative. I thought, to the chairwoman's point, that what the ranking member described is there's various ways of doing this and no one has a consistent standard. I think that's a compelling reason to do this, is because investors deserve the right to be able to look across a broad array of potential investments and make the ones that are most closely aligned with what their investment needs are, and if in making those judgments climate is one of the issues that will, from a moral perspective, they have every right to have that information. Having multiple ways of looking at this really doesn't help the investor, which this is intended to do. And look, this is why public corporations exist, to be able to accumulate capital, raise capital, expand. That's why we create them in the first place. This, to me, furthers that opportunity. And frankly, I do think, and sorry we don't see eye to eye on this, Mr. Hill, but this will pressure companies on climate change policy. I mean, that is one of the impacts of doing this. And frankly, given where we are, the existential threat of climate to the planet, I think the more that we push all of us to do the right things, to make us look more attractive, I can't imagine, frankly, a more important thing to do. So there may be certain provisions in each of the 5 bills that I don't love, but I think in total, this is an important package, and it does equip investors, particularly in an increasingly complicated world. And I've seen some of these investor packages come in front of us. You know, I'm reminded sometimes we require so much disclosure, after a while it's hard to even get information, and those are thick packets, and they need a lot to wade through when you're an investor. But making sure that the standards are the same and making sure that we're requiring the same type of reporting, to me, I think is critically important. And so I appreciate the chair and her work and the work of her staff in getting this together, and the various members whose ideas comprise this bill. And while I do always have some sensitivity to the idea that you don't want disclosure just for the sake of making people too busy work, this does not apply to small mom and pops. I've heard the name mentioned. These are public corporations. These are not small mom and pops. This is not someone who's still in the garage working on some project. It's someone who's gotten to the point where they're a publicly traded corporation. That's a big deal. They do have the resources to be able to do this, and it seems to me they should be required to do it. So with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. I don't know, Mr. Hill, I don't know if you wanted to respond. I just wanted to give you the opportunity, if that's what you...
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, in the spirit of equal time, although I certainly enjoy my colleagues' points of view on this. I don't want to get into debate with a constitutional lawyer from Maryland.
Neither do I.
That would be extremely unwise. But I do want to say to him that I think he's perhaps exaggerated the position here. Companies do disclose political contributions. Here's Procter & Gamble's off their website, $205,000. Your name wasn't on here, but a lot of your colleagues are. They do disclose it. They disclose all of their trade associations, $9.4 million in dues they pay to trade associations, and they gave $50,000 to some do-good activity in Ohio.
Forgive me, Mr. Hill, is that the corporation or is that the PAC?
It's the corporation.
It's the corporation.
Both. The PAC, $205,000, and the corporation, $9.4 million, all their association dues that they contribute.
Yep.
That's very standard among the companies. 80% of the Fortune or the S&P 500 have this kind of material out on their website. The point about climate is...
I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt, but just curious, so if 80% are doing it, what's your objection to the requirement?
Because it's not material. And the SEC, we're talking about the SEC here, and the SEC disclosure rules for public companies, for a 10K or a 10Q, has a legal standard they meet, which is that of materiality. And that's what we're debating, what the SEC requires in financial disclosure. The FEC already requires the federal disclosure of all these contributions, political contributions, contributions that are made for these other purposes. And many companies voluntarily disclose that information. Why? Because they want to be more transparent, to meet Mr. Raskin's point. The point is that the same is true for other aspects of what we've talked about today. But on climate, which is a principal issue that's being debated today, it must be done in a way that's fair and cost-effective. And it's not a reason to agree because they're experimenting with what's right. That's because the science is completely agreed upon, industry by industry, about how to disclose those financial metrics. And you're going to produce confusion to investors and be misleading to investors, in my view, in my experience, if you mandate something that's not agreed upon industry by industry.
But let me just, if I may, say to you, Mr. Hill, what you are deciding in the way that you're presenting is that the bills that we have before you, the big bill we have before you with all of the other bills included, somehow are not material, that materiality has not been thought of. Somehow it will not fit the SEC's definition of materiality. I don't think you can do that by suggesting that somehow, because of materiality, we don't need to have any other bills. We don't need to have any other leadership from the Congress of the United States. I submit to you that I believe they are material.
Okay, well, we have a ability to agree to disagree on that point about what's material and what's needed for disclosure, but I'll leave it at that. But you make good points, but I would argue that companies, you have to have diversity of view out there. You've got Warren Buffett, a well-renowned CEO. Berkshire Hathaway famously makes no contributions, charitable or political in any way, shape, or form on purpose, because Buffett's philosophy is, look, that's not for us to do. That's for our shareholders. They can sell their stock and give it to whoever they want to. That's his philosophy. Others don't have it, but many disclose it, what they do.
Mr. Chairman? Oh, just one very quick point to Mr. Hill's fine points there. The corporations, of course, are still banned from making campaign contributions at the federal level directly from the Tillman Act. That's not been overthrown yet by the Supreme Court. But the corporate dark money loophole is that there is no disclosure of large amounts of money that are flowing from corporations into 501c4 organizations, 501c3 organizations, 501c6 organizations. There's lots of money that flows out of those corporations that the shareholders, I think, not only would they be interested in it, but they've got a right to know because the money is theirs. Now, I was opposed to Citizens United. I like much more your description of Warren Buffett's conception of a corporation, which I think was the reigning conception on the Supreme Court for centuries under what Chief Justice John Marshall said in the Dartmouth College case, that it's an economic entity, and it's structured for economic purposes for the accumulation of wealth, the investment of wealth, and so on. It's not political. But the moment that it got converted, transmogrified into a political entity, I think that the shareholders have a right to know where their money is going. And really, I would go beyond that. I mean, this to me is just, just the bare minimum. I think they've got a right to decide. In England, if a corporation would dare to spend any money in politics, it's got to get the majority vote of the shareholders because theoretically, they're representing the shareholders. Please.
I would argue that shareholders today have the right to petition boards of directors through the proxy process and do something like that, disclose these kinds of activities. They could even have a proxy vote on a particular metric, pick one, and that they want the company to disclose that, or political contributions and the pay issue that was discussed in the bill too, the percentage pay increase. But generally, those don't earn a majority vote of shareholders, even including some of the most passionate institutional shareholders supporting some of these concepts. So shareholders have a right to petition. And I was reviewing last proxy seasons, and I was shocked, even though I've been in this business a long time, that over 50% of all the proposals submitted in the 2020 proxy season were submitted by fewer than 10 entities. So it's not, and they are very political entities petitioning companies on behalf of a political agenda. Frankly, to your point, meaning we are politicizing the proxy in a big way based on whatever the trends are in society at the time. And these are really not governance trends, they are more social trends. And some have succeeded and some haven't. But my point is, you asked, do they have a right to petition? And they do. Yield back.
Well, and I'll yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
If the gentleman would yield. I think it's a difference between how many submitted and how many won were able to win their point of view. We know that there was a period of time, and perhaps it's still going on now, where there was attempts by, civil rights organizations and others to buy small shares so that they could get in there and, make a case for investors having more information, et cetera, et cetera. But very seldom do they win. they lose, even though they can submit.
Yeah, and all I would say before yielding back, Mr. Chairman, is that when you do public opinion polls on this, overwhelmingly, the American people say, of course there should be sunlight, there should be disclosure. They have a right to these facts. And it may be the case that if you can find shareholders who can summon up the resources and the time and the energy to create one of these resolutions, and the way it works, you know, in these proxy battles is the company can put information in there saying that the board of directors recommends a no vote on whatever. Like, you know, we would recognize that not to be anything like a fair fight in terms of an election. And I think this just gives them the information and they can decide what to do with it. I yield back.
So, and Mr. Morelli yields back his time. Ms. Scanlon's, you'll say, Mr. DeSagne?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, I wish I was there, but I do want to thank Chairman Walters. These are really important bills if we want to deal not just with climate change, but with income inequality and transparency in the market for small investors. And I will speak up.
Yeah, your volume is
hear
not
me,
coming
Bill?
through like it did last time. I don't know what happened.
Sorry, it's my technology. Well, let me just yield back and say thank you so much.
Okay. Just said thank you. That's, you know, right.
You're welcome.
Ms. Ross.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairman, for bringing this bill forward. As has been pointed out, the bill provides investors and market participants with the information they need to make fully informed financial decisions in today's economy. And I just want to make 3 points here, one of which hasn't been made, but the first one has been made a couple times. Investors want this information, and it's companies that are resisting it. The second point is it's the investors' money. It's their money. So they don't feel like they have enough information to make decisions about which companies they want to invest in. There's something wrong with that picture. There's something wrong when companies control the information, control how the rulemaking goes. Companies have a lot more money to influence the rulemaking than individual investors do. And if people want to know what they're investing their money in, we should make sure they have access to that information. The final point is there was an amendment added to this bill by Mr. Himes that requires information on cybersecurity. Well, I'm going to vote for this bill just because that amendment was added. I'm in full support of that amendment. I represent North Carolina, where the Colonial Pipeline was shut down for more than a week. People couldn't get gas. And we are talking about a company that doesn't want the government to tell them how they should have cybersecurity. It is about time we protect investors and we protect the public. This is a good bill, and I commend it to my colleagues, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Neguse. I don't think he's okay. All right. Anybody else have any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much. You can leave.
Okay.
Are there any other? Yeah, I know. Does any? They've lost all their socials. Right. I know. I know. That's right. Are any other members? Are there any other members who wish to testify in HR 1187? Seeing none, that closes the hearing on 1187. All right. Before we move on to the motion on the rule today, I want to take care of 2 items. We all still greatly feel the loss of our good friend and colleague, L.C. Hastings, and I feel his absence even more so now than even more so now that we sit in this room and we don't have him next to all of us. However, we must move forward with his memory at the forefront of our minds to appoint a new vice chair and a new chair of the subcommittee on legislative and budget process. Clause 2D of Rule 11, adopted by the House, provides that the committee chair designates a vice chair. Pursuant to the rule, I designate the gentleman from California, the Honorable Mark DeSagne, as vice chair of the committee. Mr. DeSagne is a true public servant, Politics for him is all about helping people, and that's what he strives to do every single day. We have all seen his grit and determination firsthand many times over. His constituents are lucky to have such a fighter in their corner. The fact that he's from Lowell, Massachusetts, and attended the College of the Holy Cross, which is in Worcester, my home city, doesn't hurt either. His humor gets us all through many late nights and early mornings up here, and I look forward to continuing to work with him here on this committee. At this time, I yield to the gentlewoman from California to make a unanimous consent request on our new subcommittee appointments.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the following changes be made to the subcommittee assignments. The Subcommittee on Legislative and Budget Process appoint Mr. Morelli as chair and add Mr. Neguse. The Subcommittee on Rules and Organization of the House remove Mr. Morelli and add Mr. Neguse.
Without objection, so ordered. Now the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from California, Ms. Torres.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 256 to repeal the authorization for the use of military force against Iraq resolution of 2002, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill, and the rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule provides for consideration of H.R. 1187, the Corporate Governance Improvement and Investor Protection Act under a structure rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services or their designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-5 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides that following debate, each further amendment printed in the Rules Committee report not either considered as part of amendments en bloc pursuant to Section 4 shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent, and an opponent may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand or division of the question. The rule provides that at any time after debate, the chair of the Committee on Financial Services or her designee shall offer amendments en bloc consisting of further amendments printed in the Rules Committee report not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services or their designees. Shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the Rules Committee report or amendments en bloc described in Section 4 of the resolution. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. The rule provides that the provisions of Section 202 of the National Emergencies Act shall not apply to House Joint Resolution 46. And the rule provides that House Resolution 467 is hereby adopted. Finally, the rule provides that at any time through the legislative day of Thursday, June 17, 2021, the Speaker may entertain motions offered by the majority leader or a designee that the House suspend the rules with respect to multiple measures that the object of motions to suspend the rules on the legislative days of June 14th or 15th, 2021, and on which the yeas and nays were ordered and further proceedings postponed. The chair shall put the question on any such motions without or intervening motion, and the ordering of the yeas and nays on postponed motions to suspend the rules with respect to such measures is vacated.
Thank you. You heard the motion of the gentlewoman from California, and before I go to any discussion or amendment, I just want to say to Mr. Morelli that when we elevated you, Louise smiled. She approved. But congratulations. We appreciate it, and we appreciate your service here. I yield now to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment with respect to H.J. Res 46. Excuse me. Let me go with this other one first, Mr. Chairman, if I'm going to have two. The committee to provide an open rule for H.R. 1187. Mr. Chairman, we've discussed at length, there's obviously considerable agreement, but a lot of disagreement on that particular piece of legislation as well. And I think it would benefit from the ability of both sides to put their ideas on the table for open discussion. I think it would be a welcome bipartisan move on this committee's part, so would move for an open rule on H.R. 1187.
Heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
Chair, I think the noes have it.
Well, on that, just to be certain, Mr. Chairman, not that I would ever doubt your judgment, but I'd ask for a roll call.
Roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli?
No.
Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No!
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross?
No.
Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments?
Before I move this next one, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that Mr. Sagnier's enthusiastic response shows you chose wisely and well for your new vice chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee strike from the appropriate second language related to H.J. Res 46 introduced by Representative Gozar. Mr. Chairman, it's been well over a year since the President's announced a national emergency regarding COVID. At that time, we've seen tremendous progress as the country recovers from the pandemic. Vaccine is working, and the President's own scientists have backed up that claim. Even states and localities are rescinding their states of emergency related to COVID. It only seems natural that Congress works to move past this pandemic. However, the Speaker seems afraid of even having such a discussion, and so she's blocking legislation by Mr. Gozar from even reaching the floor. Mr. Chairman, it seems to me just another way that House Democrats are blocking debate on issues that are inconvenient. The majority's eliminated the traditional motion to recommit with instructions. The majority's turned off the tolling of days for the war powers resolutions. The majority's turned off the tolling of days for resolutions of inquiry. And now the majority's stopping the House from even debating whether COVID remains a national emergency. You may have concerns about the COVID virus. I think that's appropriate, and those concerns are very understandable. All Republicans are asking is that we are afforded the ability to have the conversation on the House floor rather than yet again being shut out from the House process. So I urge the adoption of the motion and yield back.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I would just say that I think, we have made great strides in combating the COVID-19 pandemic, but the pandemic is not over. And there are people who are still hurting, and we shouldn't abruptly terminate the emergency declaration to score political points. We're reopening in a responsible way. We are now meeting in person in this committee, and other committees, I think, are as well. my advice to Mr. Gosar is that, you know, he should get vaccinated, and he should urge others to do that. That would be a responsible thing to do at this moment. But in any event, I know where the gentleman's coming from, and I appreciate his offering the amendment, but I would respectfully urge a no vote on this. Any other discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. I think the noes have it. Roll call vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross? No. Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments? Dr. Burgess.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to strike the deeming of the budget from the rule. Look, budget's one of the most important things that we do, being a valuable member of the Budget Committee myself. I understand the importance. President Biden once said, "Show me your budget, and I'll show you what you value." Clearly, no one wants to discuss the Democrats' budget right now, but it has been a method of using reconciliation to put forward pretty unpopular priorities. So it's not surprising, but it's still very concerning that once again we find ourselves in the unnecessary situation of having to deem a budget as passed within a rule. You know, historically, the budget process has given members of all ideologies an opportunity to present the American people their values. We're all familiar with, we used to have budget days on the floor of the House where we would all spend the entire day listening to various groups propose their budget. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I feel the frustration that many, and I know our side of the dais feel, on not having this normal process. So I certainly hope we can agree that this is not a process the Democratic majority should be proud of. By adopting this motion, hopefully the Democrats will at least mark up a budget in the Budget Committee, even if they're unwilling to debate it on the House floor. So I urge adoption of this motion, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and let me begin by congratulating him for getting his amendment in order. We made him number one on our list. Let me just say that given the timing of the President's budget, the Appropriations Committee will need to get started before we have a budget resolution. We want to get these appropriations bills done in July. Deeming a top-line number for appropriators is a housekeeping item that we can take care of so we can move forward, and then turn our attention to a budget resolution and enacting the transformational policies, including the President's American Jobs and American Families Plan. I should also point out that my friends have used this approach as well. So this is not something that has never been used before, and Republicans have done this as well. So I'm anxious to get the appropriations process moving forward. Can't do that unless we have top-line numbers that have been appropriately allocated. Again, President Biden's budget was late coming here. So we will get to all of this, and so I would urge a no vote on your amendment, because that would essentially mean that we would be delaying the Appropriations Committee from getting its work done. I think we need to get this stuff done.
Mr. Chairman, I would just point out that it has been 900 days since the House has passed the budget, and that should be one of our primary responsibilities.
And I expect we will get to that. Yeah.
I don't expect we'll get to that. I mean, frankly, the reality is the majority was not able to get to a budget last year in committee, let alone on the floor. There's no reason to believe they're going to do it. And this, I mean, just run it through the committee. This is really something, a budget ought to be settled by the majority party. This is really in your purview, and, you know, it's an abdication of your responsibility, and we all deserve the debate. Mr. Burgess made a very important point. I've been here a lot of years, and there would be a variety of budgets on the floor. There would be a Black Caucus budget. There would be a Republican Study Committee budget. There would be a progressive budget. That's an important exchange. That's an important process. My friends can still, we ought to go through the process. If you have to deem it in the end, I guess you could still deem it in the end, but not having any discussion on what the budget priorities are going to be, I say this is appropriate. I appreciate your effort to facilitate that process. I still have great optimism that the Appropriations Committee will deliver. We'll get most of its bills done before the August break and across the floor, and we'll be set for some meaningful negotiation in the fall. But the budget process is part of that. I think this is a place where, frankly, with all due respect to the majority, they haven't been able to get their act together since they've been the majority. It's time to do it. So,
Well, I hope we follow through. But in the meantime, again, you know, it's not unusual for a president in his first term for their budget to be late. It is late, and we need to get moving on the appropriations process. You know, markups and getting things ready for the floor right after the July 4th recess. So I mean, that's why we're doing this, and I think I think at this point this is the way we need to proceed if we're going to get our appropriations work done, as the gentleman says, before the August break. So I would say no. I would urge a no on Dr. Burgess's amendment. With that, anybody else? If not, the vote is on the Burgess amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Can you chair the noes have it? Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross? No. Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Cole?
aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk report the total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee make and order amendment number 8, offered by Ranking Member McHenry to H.R. 1187. This amendment changes the bill and amendment's effective date contingent on the labor force participation rate reaching the same level it was in January of 2020. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is frankly very simple. It does not prevent the legislation from going into effect. Rather, it just delays implementation until we can get labor participation back to pre-pandemic levels. Right now, our domestic legislative priorities should primarily focus on economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Congress must prioritize getting people back to work rather than just passing legislation that places regulatory burdens on job creators and stifles Main Street America investment opportunities. I urge the adoption of my motion, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
For the gentleman's amendment, any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Reschenthaler amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. No. Can you, the chair, the noes have it?
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a roll call vote.
Roll call vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter?
No.
Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Lift up your window.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Mr. Chair?
Ms. Fishbach.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make and order amendment number 9 by Ranking Member McHenry to H.R. 1187. This amendment allows emerging growth companies, small businesses, and smaller reporting companies to opt out of the disclosure requirement. Mr. Chair, as we discussed earlier today, this legislation places enormous compliance and disclosure requirements on public companies. Simply put, this could put undue pressure on the companies looking to go public and disincentivize such actions. By providing an opt-out clause to smaller organizations, it can provide much-needed relief to such organizations and perhaps allow them to reevaluate the decision to go public. I urge adoption of my motion, and I yield back.
Heard the gentlewoman's amendment. Any discussion? Hearing none. The vote is on the Fishbach amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, I request the ayes and
We'll have a
ayes.
roll call vote, please.
Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres? No. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin? No. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon? No. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier? No. Ms. Ross? No. Ms. Ross? No. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse? No. Mr. Cole?
Aye.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Burgess? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments? Hearing none, now the vote is on the motion of the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no? No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chair, on that, we request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Raskin? Aye. Mr. Raskin? Aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier? Aye. Ms. Ross? Aye. Ms. Ross? Aye. Mr. Neguse? Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse? Aye. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler? No. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
Motion is agreed to, and I will carry it for the majority.
And Mr. Reschenthaler will carry it for the Republican.
Okay, Mr.
Having
Perlmutter.
voted on the prevailing side, I'd like to ask for immediate reconsideration of the election of Mr. Morelli.
We will entertain that at the next meeting. Thank you all, and I think, with the exception of a little bit of a audio issue, this worked fairly well, so we will see you soon. All right. Committee is adjourned. Oh, yeah, 5 o'clock is the